Good morning, ACPE. I'm your host, Stephen Yamada with OETC, and welcome to Lessons Learned from a Cyber Attack System Admin Perspective. Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. Just so you know, this session is being recorded. And if you have any questions during the presentation, put them in chat and we'll answer them at the end if there's time. Lastly, please do not use the Q&A section of the sidebar as it will not be monitored. With that out of the way, I'd like to welcome our speakers. Today we have Ski Kaczorowski and John Biggerstaff, system admins at North Shore School District. Ski, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Sure. So my name is Ski, and this is John Biggerstaff. This talk is going to cover a ransomware attack at the North Shore School District that happened in the fall of 2019. We will talk briefly about our environment and then cover the attack before spending most of the time on the lessons that we learned from the attack. Frankly, we were very surprised by the attack. We had spent years assuming that school districts were not really targets because we don't have customer data or credit card information or anything like that. We knew we needed to improve our security, but we couldn't make it a district priority. School districts, however, are very good targets for ransomware attacks because we have very few technical staff and large budgets. In 2019, over 1,000 schools were hit, some of them multiple times. And the trend has only continued, as in this year, over half of the ransomware attacks in the US affected K-12 schools. So the North Shore School District is a mid-sized school district with 4,000 staff and 23,000 students. We're spread over 60 square miles and 38 sites. Our data center consisted of 300 Windows, Linux, and black box servers running on 400 terabytes of NAS and iSCSI storage. We have Mac, Windows, Chromebook workstations, and iPads. And like most school districts, we're a 5x10 shop and severely understaffed for the workload we have. Security was never made a priority because it is more costly, it requires more staff, and it is usually inconvenient. Our critical services at the time of the attack were the student information system, payroll, phones, and email. We were required to report the event that happened to the FBI, who also brought in Homeland Security. They provided us with some interesting information about the organizations behind the attack. First, the Emotech group hit, infected our systems, and offered us up for bid once enough of the computers were infected. The group that won the bid then deployed TrickBot to get admin level permissions for key systems. Once the second group had admin permissions, we were offered up for bid a second time, and a RUK group won. The RUK groups are even more interesting because the original developers of RUK operate like a franchise, licensing certain code to various groups who are then allowed to make modifications and getting payments in return for successful attacks. Attacks are typically triggered on a late Friday or early Saturday to minimize detection, and right before a major process to maximize the chance of a payout. The attack on our systems began at 11:37 on Friday, September 20th, so the attackers had hours to do their damage before we were aware of the attack. Our payroll was scheduled to run in 4 days on September 24th. Note that the events leading up to the attack take place over months, not weeks or even days. They're on your environment for quite some time.
Hey, Ski, real quick. I know you can't see the chat, but someone's asking if you can hide that sharing dialog. At the bottom, just click hide there.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
All right, thanks. Is
that better?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. So the thing about a ransom attack is it's an emotional roller coaster. When you're first hit, you may not be looking for ransomware, but instead of why is the server not working, right? Or why is the service has a problem? Then once you identify that it's ransomware, panic kind of hits and you wonder how bad it is and the extent of the damage. While you're going through this process, you get hope saying, well, okay, the things I put in place, such as my backups will save me, or maybe the antivirus I have in place will stop it from spreading, but then despair when you realize that these processes you have in place didn't work. This is even worse for those you report to, because at first you say, fine, I've got backups. And then you come back later and say, well, the backups aren't working. So the report keeps changing as you investigate more systems. The only warning we had that evening were some high CPU alerts, which were ignored because we were still configuring our monitoring system and we were receiving many false positives. It took several hours to wake up all our staff and understand how widely it had spread. After the initial shock wore off, we shut down all the Windows servers and disconnected the network to stop the spread. We then focused on trying to figure out what services were impacted, what were still running. For us, the most critical process was the payroll process that's now happening in 3 days. There is an incredible amount of uncertainty. Your trusted network, where you've never had problems, is no longer safe. What could be lurking on it? What back doors have been left behind? And John, I think you had something?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in and just add to this a bit. And so yes, this presentation is from a sysadmin's perspective. And for all the sysadmins watching and people in technology, as you know, it's maybe a stereotype, but we tend to be very analytical, logical, ones and zeros. But we're humans. And if any of you watched Sarah and Shelby's presentation yesterday, they did a great job on really talking about that side of it. And this was an extremely emotional time, really tough time, physically, mentally, emotionally for all of us involved. So I just kind of wanted to take, very briefly, just kind of walking through those first moments, at least from my perspective. And so, Saturday morning about 6 a.m., I get the text. In fact, I wake up to a text from my manager saying, we've been hit by something. We don't know what. Get in here right away, which is exactly what you want to hear on a Saturday morning, right? So I'm driving in and, everything, all these different things are going through my head. What could this be? It can't be that bad. Hopefully it's not that bad. Is it just another banana in the server room, which is totally a North Shore inside joke, but I'm not even going to explain it. But, so we get in and Ski and I are about the first two in, pretty quickly identify that it's a ransomware attack. That doesn't take too long to figure out. And shortly after that, from that point, you're trying to figure out the extent of the damage, and Ski will talk more about that. But from my perspective, I'm sitting here, and as a system admin, you always have hope, right? Like there's always, you're hopeful by nature. I just feel like we are anyways, where you have a problem and there's always going to be a solution, right? You're always figuring something out. And, so I'm sitting here and we're looking at the extent of the damage, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But then you go to, what have we always got? We've always got backups, right? Okay, it's going to be a huge recovery process. We're going to start doing restores that'll take, the whole weekend, maybe into next week. Well, then, as you're going to find out, we realized all of our backups are gone. They got to our backups. They cut us off from these things. So it's just, Ski mentioned despair, and that couldn't be more accurate, is there is this feeling of complete and total despair when you realize it's gone. It's all gone. For me, Active Directory, it's gone. It's not coming back. This is no longer a recovery. This is a complete rebuild. We have to rebuild everything. And I know Ski and I put in close to about 100 hours that first week, and not just us, other people as well. But so I just wanted to bring that side of it into this. If you haven't considered your district a target, or if there is not much concern, I would like to impart to you a healthy dose of fear, because I would have loved somebody to do that for me prior to this happening. Anyways, go ahead, Ski.
Okay, realizing that we're going to need more help, we started contacting contractors, and at that point notified the FBI. And each technology team focused on triaging their area to figure out the extent of the damage. We got some good news. First is that all the NAS data was recoverable because we had hardware snapshots, and most of the databases were actually stored on the NAS. So we had the database backups. In addition, all our student services, email and classroom management services were running because they're either not based on Windows or they were hosted. Most of our staff were not on Windows workstations, so most of the staff and students could still work. They were minimally impacted. By 9 p.m. on that first day, we're planning for how to recover and in what order. Active Directory was a top priority, as that's used for authentication across many systems and impacted everyone. Payroll is, because that's a big legal issue if you don't get that out. And then the student information system, because that's used by all the students, teachers, and parents daily. Right behind that was the phone system. We get hundreds of voicemails every day, and now we couldn't get them. Our leadership sent us home at midnight to avoid burnout.
Yeah, so I'm going to add to that a little bit again, and I promise this will be the last time I talk about me and my emotions, but It's just such a big part of this, at least for me, even going back over my notes to present, to prepare for this thing it's taken me back through a lot of that. It's been eye-opening that it still feels that way, even an hour and a half, a year and a half after the incident. So yeah, so Ski mentioned that our leadership sent us home at midnight to avoid burnout, because you're in that mode of just go, go, go. And I feel like a lot of us would have just stayed there all night working on this, but obviously that's not healthy for anyone. But so you get home. I mean, it's not a relaxing night of sleep. It's not like, well, all a good day's work, let's hit the sack. It's all of these questions. Actually, I wanted to throw in, Ski had an analogy. I don't know if it was his or if he got it from somebody, but you wake up one morning and you find out like 70% of the city has been demolished. And sure, there's still some structures here and there, but plumbing's wiped out, electrical's wiped out. And for a lot of these things, you don't even have the original plans that you use to put these things in place and to build these. And you don't remember what contractors all had different parts in this. So it's just a disaster. So anyways, going home and all of these questions going through my mind, at that point, I knew I had to rebuild AD. How do I rebuild AD? I haven't done that in years, not from scratch. How do we provision all of our users? Should I use the same domain name or a different one? How am I going to sync a new domain to our existing Azure AD tenant without wiping everything out that I've got up there or duplicating everything, or worse? OMG, my GPOs are gone. For those of us that know Active Directory, that's kind of a big deal, especially if you haven't documented any of that. What about all the tweaks to AD that I never documented? And then lastly, maybe they will just fire me tomorrow and I won't have to worry about this. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but there were some moments where I feel like personally it might have been preferable. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. So on day 2, we had identified the affected systems and likely available backup data, and we're working to get things fixed. Various teams were working on setting up Active Directory, building new virtual servers and server templates, rebuilding the payroll system, reviewing all the network logs to figure out how they got on our systems, rebuilding the ESXi hosts. We had no idea if they had put backdoors on ESXi. You have to check everything. We had to order new anti-malware software on Sunday because we just had to have something, because the stuff we had sure didn't give us a single warning or anything. We started to run into management and logistical issues as contractors and additional staff showed up to help. John and I became incredible choke points in that everybody needed to talk to us about things, and we had a hard time getting any useful work done. Word of the attack spread through the community, and more offers of help were coming in. It was kind of like the mythical man month. We were getting calls from other school districts, but also from other vendors, saying, hey, we heard you got attacked. Is there anything we can do to help? Management started to assign roles to people and groups to provide food, create office space, track expenses, be gophers, develop a document for tracking work, and more. So in the first week, it was Monday before the insurance company was notified, because they don't work on weekends. But by that afternoon, we were talking to an incident response contractor they had hired for dealing with this incident. The incident response contractor had us install their preferred anti-malware software on all the servers, run their forensic script software on all the servers, provide full access to our O365 email domain, install a network IDS system, and not delete any data or old server images. Now imagine all that stuff on top of us trying to recover our systems. This work had to happen while we were still trying to get everything up and running. Even with all the extra work, however, the incident response contractor was really good, because they had been through these events multiple times, and they were able to assure us that we only needed to be concerned about Windows machines. We didn't have to rebuild all the ESXi servers. I didn't have to worry about all the Linux machines and things like that, which was really nice. A decision was made to move the student records system from on-prem to a SaaS solution. This saved us from rebuilding 27 servers, and more importantly, meant that people could work on that without going through the system admin choke point. We also had some good luck with the phone system, where that had been recently upgraded, and the support contractor had set up backwards to a hosted service during our most recent update. We lost the old voicemails, but we got everything else back. And most important of all, they managed to complete payroll on time.
All right, so attack aftermath. It's happened. We're trying to figure this out. So in a ransomware attack, what we learned, so you first think in terms of hours, then days, then weeks, and finally, in a case as bad as ours, in months, as you get things running again. Most of our services were up in a month. We had some up in a week, some in 2 weeks, but I would say most of them were up in a month. Files restored on our on-prem file server, those are mostly restored. That took about 2 months with the developer that we had, putting a lot of work and time into that, and we'll touch a little bit more on that later, some of the challenges we faced there. But long days continued into December, not your 100-hour work weeks, but still, it was just long, hard, grueling days. With eventually a light at the end of the tunnel. But we even had a contractor who had overseas staff that could continue building systems, running forensic scripts while we slept at night. So if you ever need that, it's very valuable to have a contractor who can work off hours like that. We use this event to clean up systems. So this kind of touches on some silver linings too, which we'll touch on at the end. But we took advantage of this time to get rid of old Windows Server OSs. So we had some 2003 boxes sitting around that I'd wanted to get off for a long time, 2008, some 2012 servers. So anything we could reasonably upgrade at that time, we made sure we took the extra time to do that. We got everything up and patched, which had been an ongoing challenge for a while. Instead of restoring everything on our file server, in some cases, we only restored what people asked for. So you kind of get rid of some of that old stuff that you're never sure if people are actually using or not. And some legacy systems we never did rebuild because people never asked for them. So again, a good opportunity to kind of leave some of that stuff behind. On the topic of domain admins, so I will very reluctantly talk about later about what I was doing wrong here. But for now, I'm just going to say, currently at North Shore, no user account has any elevated privileges. We run on a zero trust model. I'll talk more about that later as well. We've started using what we call super user accounts. I'll talk more about that later. Those are the accounts that we elevate, but even those in their natural state are zero rights for the most part, at least on Windows systems. And then another thing is we moved some services to SaaS providers. I think Ski mentioned moving our SIS system to a SaaS provider. So we did that eventually with time cards, our library service, food services, and we have plans to do more of that. So one thing we did, we implemented a new backup solution with improved air gapping. Ski's going to talk about that, I think, in the next slide, for key backups. We implemented a SIM solution. If you saw Nathan's presentation yesterday morning, he talked about that. Absolutely critical for knowing what is happening on your servers. And for months, these bad guys were on our servers. We didn't know, okay, because we didn't have anything like that. Now we do. We rebuilt our server monitoring service and put more focus on it to cut down on false positives, which is very important. We got approval to fill 2 new positions. So we have a network security engineer and another sysadmin, both who are probably watching this presentation. And I can't tell you how grateful Ski and I and many others are to have them on board. We completed a security review using the CIS-20 controls as a baseline. We're now implementing those changes. It takes time. Yeah, I know we're a year and a half after the attack. It takes time. We'll talk more about that. And lastly, I can't overstate this, but this event has really changed how we work. And I guess even just talking personally, it's changed how I approach projects, how I make decisions. And one thing I have said ever since this attack happened, and this is nothing new for most of you, but security is not convenient. Okay, and Beaverton did a great talk yesterday talking about security and the inconvenience of it, but also, there are areas obviously where you can you don't want to make it inconvenient for people. So if you can have security and convenience together, that's ideal. But let's say, take MFA, for instance. MFA is not convenient. It's not convenient every time I want to connect to Azure AD or Exchange through PowerShell that I have to pull out my phone and type in the code every single time, or even once a week. I think we have it set for some of our privileged accounts, and every 2 weeks for other. It's just there's a lot of, it slows processes down, right? I mean, you guys know this. It complicates things. But as you can imagine, for us, security is now a top priority. And it's not that it wasn't a priority or that we weren't aware of it before, but when you're stretched so thin, you are more focused on keeping systems up, keeping things running, and unfortunately, security can sort of take a back seat. Okay, so now we're going to cover specific lessons that we learned. Go ahead, Ski.
Okay. The first lesson is that you're going to have a lot of roles that you have to fill. And if you don't fill them, you're going to have some issues. So I use the incident command system that's been around since essentially World War II, that's used by governments and companies around the world. I do recommend that you have one liaison person for departments and another for all the contractors who are going to be assisting you for answering questions like, when will services be up? Who needs access to what, why, and when? The public information officer is going to have to prepare communications for staff, students, parents, and the media. Yes, we had a TV truck at the admin building several times during this event. Logistics provides food, workspaces, and does all the non-technical tasks. We found creating quiet rooms where people could work uninterrupted was very helpful. John, who was rebuilding our Active Directory domain, was actually locked in a room where only his supervisor could approve somebody to disturb him. It was that important to make sure he could focus. And also that allows him to work in an area where he can just put the tech support on speakerphone, right? Finally, you need finance to track all the costs for the insurance claim, and also figure out how you're going to pay people when you don't have an accounting system. Relationships are absolutely critical. This is the only thing that got us through it. Without good relationships, we would have not been able to recover our systems as quickly as we did. We have a relationship with a local hosting firm. They provided 5 experienced system admins, some of them who were located overseas, and a project manager. We use them for almost all of the forensic work, anti-malware installation, and many of the server rebuilds. We also had a relationship with a contract developer who created a map between the SIDs and CNs that we recovered from the old AD system that was critical in building up the new one and restoring the file server. The contractor also did most of the file server restoration. The student records vendor, Synergy, was willing to drop everything and complete a typical 6-month migration to their SaaS solution in 6 days. A parent who worked at Microsoft made sure that we had access to support we needed to figure out Office 365 syncing issues, as going through normal channels was just not successful. Other school districts sent their system admins to help out. And it's not just external relationships, it's relationships within your department. The help desk, management, and instructional teams were incredible at making sure that the rest of technology could focus on rebuilding our infrastructure. Okay, John?
Yep. Yeah, so I'm also trying to follow the chat a little bit. So Alan Mita mentioned that you mentioned the media trucks being in our parking lot. And I forgot about this. Jeff Miller actually made them get out of his parking space, which, if any of you know Jeff Miller, I don't know if you do. If you don't, you should meet him, and you would probably understand that he would do that. But as far as the relationships are critical, so I just wanted to point out one thing. It's so important to plan ahead and have some contacts that you are able to feel comfortable reaching out to. It's good to have that plan laid out for who you would contact in the event of a cyber attack. And I guess the only thing I wanted to touch on, you don't just want to call the first person you can find in the midst of a panic. You're desperate for answers, you're desperate for solutions, and it's too easy to listen to anyone that sounds like they know what they're talking about. So I would just say in those circumstances, don't be afraid to say, this relationship isn't working. So again, relationships are critical, but make sure they're the right ones.
Yeah, and it's really good to have an open relationship, because remember, you can't create a PO, and unless they're willing to take a credit card, you have to have some way to pay them. So we actually had open relationships with these people, and we could just say, yeah, just use the existing PO.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing is your backup system has to be air-gapped 100% of the time. Ours wasn't. According to the incident response contractor, attackers have automated routines to find and corrupt backups. And so you either need the physical one, like removable media, or a technical one, like snapshots. Because our backup was not air-gapped 100% of the time, all the attacker had to do was just render the file system. They don't encrypt your backups. They just trash the file system, which is apparently really easy to do with REFS.
Yep.
So after you've been hit, you need to immediately create a new backup system instead, in case you're hit a second time, because many ransomware targets are hit a second time about a month to 2 months after they were hit the first time, presumably to catch them already drained from a previous recovery and more willing to pay a ransom. So we essentially reinstalled our backup software on a snapshotted file system, which provided the technical air gap until we could replace it. If your backups are not accessible, look for other locations. We found a vendor that had a backup for the phone system. Look for staff who may have made backups and they have them on their local machines. But look elsewhere. You'll probably find a lot of the data you need. Some of it you'll have to recreate from hand, but in many cases, you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, so in that one case, Ski mentioned our phone system. That was obviously one of our critical systems that was down. We had lost all of our backups that we had for it. And so we were looking at that system as a complete rebuild. And two, during this process, something that's in the conversation we haven't really talked about yet, but is obviously it wasn't our decision, but we're involved in the conversation of, do we pay these guys? Do we not pay these guys? Is it really worth the time and effort to put in to rebuild everything? Or do we just bite the bullet and get the decryption key? So looking at some of these critical systems, like the phone system was one. If there had been a lot of these that we couldn't have recovered, well, I don't want to say that we would have paid them, but it was just in the conversation. So all that to say, with the phone system, that was one of the systems we thought we had totally lost. Talking with the network admin, he was in a conversation with the vendor a day or two after the attack and found out that they just happened to have implemented offsite backups, and our network admin had forgotten, or there was some confusion there. But so we had backups on their cloud system that we were able to use. So again, like Ski's point, if you think you've lost everything, check with the vendor, check in some creative areas. You never know what you might find.
So the insurance is going to impact you an incredible amount. Once you involve insurance, you lose a lot of control. The insurance company's goals are not the same as yours. You want to get everything working as quickly as possible. They want to make sure the attackers are off your network and aren't going to be able to come back on in order to minimize their payout. There's pressure to do what they say, or they may not pay your claim. They dictated which incident response contractor we would work with for the recovery effort, and also that we had to support that contractor in the forensic efforts to find the source and pathway of the infections. The insurance group also looks at the cost of rebuild versus the cost of ransom. In our case, if we were not able to get one or more of payroll, student information system, or phone services restored, we probably would have paid. Even so, if the ransom had been a bit lower, we may still have paid because of the losses due to our food services system, point of sale system. And yes, payouts are very common. In the first week after the attack, the insurance company paid out negotiated ransomware payments for 4 other customers. One thing the incident response contractor has you do is to run forensics on all infected machines. Running forensics on 180 servers is very time consuming. You will need to create processes using isolated private networks and virtual servers to run the forensics so you don't cause a reinfection. There is definitely a lot of tension between the incident response contractor bugging you to do the forensic work more quickly and you trying to get systems restored. We could have never done this without the contractors and especially their overseas staff who could work on our off hours. You will need to create new processes on the fly for tracking your work, such as time spent for the insurance claim, what machines are built, what need to be built next, what machines had forensics done, what services are still down, had been restored, which are next to be restored. We use Google spreadsheets for a lot of this. You also need to show interactions between various services, such as what depends on that database server, how they do authentication. This not only defines the order in what you restore things, but it also helps explain to administrative staff while some services are delayed in coming back up, why a server could come up, but they can't log into it, or why suddenly a dozen services come up at once.
Yeah, I was thinking back during that time, and I remember, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I was locked in this back office rebuilding AD, so I was sort of disassociated with a lot of what was going on. But I feel like I remember because you're looking for those small victories, right? So no matter how small the service was, anytime the service was restored, it might have been Joe Yamada. I don't know if he's on here listening, but you can throw a chat in. I felt like he had a cowbell that he would be ringing every time we had a service come up. So I just remember that sense of joy of like, yes, one more thing up. I mean, even better than an angel getting its wings, right? It's like a new service is up. One thing I was going to mention too, in case people didn't see it, some people obviously have, we have a poll up just to kind of gauge your general sense of how you feel about a ransomware attack on your district today. So just wanted to throw that out. If during this presentation, you can hop in there and vote on that.
You're going to need at least one experienced project manager and hopefully more to keep you focused on the most important tasks. This allows your technical staff to focus on recovery work. Any requests from the outside to change the priority of tasks need to go through the project manager so that the requesters are forced to compare what they want done versus all the other tasks that need to be done. It's important to take a few minutes at the start and end of each day for a sit rep of what's going on, especially when you have multiple parallel teams working along at the same time. Some staff may not be able to help as much on the critical services, but they can definitely help on the less critical systems and do all the prep work so that when the critical ones come online, everything goes smooth. You're going to have a plan, you stay calm, and you realize that plan is going to change frequently. The project manager that the contractor provided was worth their weight in gold, and I wish we could have had a few more of them. Understaffing really hurts. It has several side effects, all of which are bad and definitely show up in a ransomware. Lack of cross-training leads to having many bottlenecks during recovery. Each staff person wears multiple hats, so one person supports VMware, storage, backups, etc. What did they work on first? Projects tend to get only partly completed, such as our phone service upgrade, which did not have backups configured yet. There's a tendency to build up cruft over time as things change. You don't complete documentation. You don't fully delete deprecated systems just in case you may need access to them. Systems aren't patched and updates aren't done. Work is pushed off to contractors and vendors, so server staff aren't familiar with how the system was built or configured. We spent a lot of time tracking down contractors and vendors who did previous installations to figure out how they built the service. Staff are already tired and worn out from the constant high workload, leaving less resilient to deal with a major event. And you may find there's little to no documentation on what was done previously. For example, how do I rebuild AD? I built it up 10 years ago. I have no clue how to do it, how to make it this time. You're going to need a lot more storage. When we were told that we could not delete infected machines or encrypted data, we ran into a severe storage crunch because we run our storage at about 70% full. Can you create duplicates of all your servers and all your data on the storage you currently have? I doubt it. On the file server, we also had a few major issues. First, it was end of life. So all we had was hardware support. We could not just revert to the snapshots like you think because I can't delete the data. So I had to do copies from the snapshots. Well, that uses up storage. Whoops, a lot more storage needed because when we copied the data, we ran out of snapshot space because now I'm duplicating everything. We actually lost a little bit of data before we figured out how to deal with this problem. And remember, I had no support at this time on the file server. Also, applying Windows ACLs to the restored data is a non-starter if you have to make a change if you have a file tree that has over 100,000 plus files in it. New ACLs are required because we had a whole new AD domain with different SIDs. After several attempts and research, we found the best way to do this was basically to write a script that would look at the old directory structure, rebuild all the directories in the new location, and then copy the files into it. So create the directories with the correct permissions, copy the files into it. And that worked pretty well. The only downside is that all the files will show the date they were copied in, not the date that they were created. And you're going to do a lot by trial and error. Just like with the file server, it took us a while, several days, to figure out the best way to do things.
Yep.
You will run into many little unexpected things. Oh, sorry, John, this is yours.
You can, okay, okay. I wasn't going to stop you. So sounds like fun so far, doesn't it? So expect a lot of trial and error. You're under pressure. You're constantly aware of how many people are being affected. I'm driving into work in the morning. I'm hearing this or news reports on the radio. I mean, it weighs down on you. You've got that pressure. Management wants updates, obviously, for good reason. But however, during this time, speed cannot be the highest priority. As fast as you want to get things done, you want to get it rebuilt, you want to get things restored, that can't be the highest priority. So I put be vigilant with a heavy dose of patience, I think is really, really important during that time. Because it's going to take much longer than you expect. I mean, think about all of these systems, and I think of all these Windows-based systems that, you know, for some of these more critical systems, we put months into these projects of planning and working with vendors and building these and then tweaking things and fixing. Well, here we're having to rush these rebuilds and try to get these things pushed out, again, quickly, but you've got to have patience because there are going to be issues. And I'm not good with patience, so that was tough. But lots of unexpected issues. How do I rebuild this server? You know, we try to document things. I think we're better than we used to be, but in some cases there was just no documentation. Or there was basic documentation, but then you make changes afterwards and you don't get back to the documentation to add that in. There's just a lot of unknowns you come across where it's like, crap, you know, how did I build this thing? How did I set up AD Connect, you know, 2.5 years ago? How do I, Ski touched on this, but how do I restore files with correct ACLs if we have new account SIDs in AD? These are all brand new objects in Active Directory, right? So they're brand new SIDs. They aren't going to map up with all of these ACLs on our file server now. That was a real pain. You're on high alert during this time. Anything that goes wrong, you're asking, are they attacking again because we haven't paid? This was a real fear, and actually, I mean, and I think well justified, because there have been cases where if you aren't paying them, they will come in and hit you again if you've left open back doors and you're still vulnerable to that. And so anything that was happening that seemed odd, which there was a lot, but I mean, anything that looked like another attack, you're just all of a sudden into that panic mode again. And honestly, I still am. There was something that happened last week with a few of our servers. We were working with our team and, you know, looking into it, it's like multiple servers are having these issues. All of a sudden, my first thought is, uh-oh, is something happening again? I mean, it's, you know, a lot of us as sysadmins have, you know, we always know attacks can happen. So, I mean, that's kind of always in the back of our mind. But once you've been through something this catastrophic, I just feel like it surfaces much more quickly, at least for me. Fortunately, we were not under attack last week. It was, I can't remember what. It wasn't that. So this it could be a good time to rethink core design decisions. So we finally got rid of our silly domain name that we had, which was ad.nsd.org for Active Directory. And we got rid of a second domain that we had set up for our SIS, which we named AD2. So here's a hint, don't let sysadmins name things. Okay, next slide, Ski. So server rebuilds are going to take time. And again, patience, lots of patience. Spend time getting your virtual server templates correct. This didn't happen our first go around with rebuilding them, mainly because I was locked in that back office maybe not locked in, but I was put in a back office to give me some time to focus. So between this and changes required by our incident response company, we ended up rebuilding templates. And consequently, some of our servers, we had to rebuild those again. And we brought in some contractors and some other people, and they were really sharp and were great at helping us rebuild things. But again, when you don't know the environment and you don't know all the intricacies of how these different systems interact with other things, there's just going to be things that aren't set up correctly. And that's just kind of the nature of it. You kind of have to accept that. So you're going to have to be fixing things afterwards for quite some time. I touched on this earlier, but take this opportunity to move off of old operating systems. So again, we got rid of old 2003 boxes, 2008 boxes. We upgraded those wherever we could, wherever it made sense. We upgraded SQL instances. These are things that take time, and it did add to the length, but again, speed wasn't our highest priority, so we were taking advantage of some of these opportunities to really bring us up to par there. Tracking down installation media, licenses, proof of purchase for systems we were rebuilding. That stuff can take time. In some cases, it took days, especially if you have unresponsive vendors, which can happen from time to time. Some were great, some jumped in and were amazing at helping out. Others were just difficult to reach and not as easy to work with. That's just going to be how it is. One recommendation, and Ski sort of headed this side of it up, but build an isolated network, either virtual or physical, to safely launch your possibly infected servers to take a look at their disks. So this happened time and time again where we had all these infected servers that were shut down, but sometimes with ransomware, well, I mean, in a ransomware situation, you can power up a server, and of course, that's where you see that HTML page pop up, and that's what we saw pop up with the Ryuk across the front and a couple email addresses. But you can get into the server, you can poke around, you can look at things. It just isn't functional for whatever that server is designed to do, right? And of course, you can see all the encrypted files. But in some cases, it was very helpful to power up a server and get in and see if there's anything recoverable on it, or at least get into some config files. I mean, you're looking for anything at this point. You're desperate in getting some of these systems built. So if you do that, you don't just want to bring it back up on your network, right? Because at that time, we weren't sure how this thing could still propagate and where this thing was actually, if it was being hosted on specific servers and pushed out from there. There were a lot of unknowns. So build your isolated network, virtual or physical. We did ours in VMware. And I think we still have that, if I'm not mistaken, Ski, that still have this a network where we can put a server onto it, power it up, and it can't get anywhere. So if we have anything that we suspect might have malware in it, or we want to test something, it's a great solution. All right, next slide. Move services to SaaS. So we've touched on this a couple of times. If you can, move some services to SaaS, even if it's temporary, just to get things up and running. In the case of our SIS, I don't know the numbers. I know it ended up costing a lot of money to do that, but it was also clearly a critical system, and it just made sense to work with it. And that vendor in particular was fantastic to work with on this. I mean, they made us a high priority, and we rushed what should have been a months-long project into, I don't know, I wasn't involved in that, but I want to say it was just a matter of a few days. But if you can move services up to SaaS, is going to reduce the number of servers your system admins have to rebuild, which is obviously a good thing. It's going to increase the number of people involved in the rebuild process, thus speeding up the entire recovery. One interesting note is our existing SaaS services were not affected. This made the event, so for instance, email. So we had migrated to O365, I think about a year before this happened, maybe 2 years, I can't remember. So that wasn't affected, clearly. Azure AD was fully intact because AD went down, nothing, no corruption synced up. So Azure AD was intact, email was intact, and this is a good thing, right? It is. Google was also up, classroom services, and it's good and bad. So we would actually get comments, and we have even since then, from people that were not involved directly in the rebuild of, well, it wasn't that bad. I mean, we still had mail. Yeah, okay, you still had mail. Maybe we should have taken that down too, just to you could feel our pain. But it's so you get those services that are up, and that's a good thing. But unfortunately, that can sort of communicate out to the larger groups that, well, it's not really as bad as everybody's saying it is. Well, on the inside, we know that it was. So, all right, go ahead, Ski.
Okay, you're going to have to create a lot of temporary work areas, both on the file server and systems, so that people can continue to do work while you're restoring the original systems. So on the file server, we'd create temporary workspaces. We'd give them a temporary machine to work on. We restore the critical data to these, and then we'd have to merge the data back into the original file system when it was restored. You also have to train people. I remember going upstairs to help train some of the people in payroll and stuff on how to access these temporary areas, how to log into their temporary systems, stuff like that. You're going to need several machines to run forensics, and temporary use for test database recovery, run limited versions of services until the final servers can be configured. You're going to need temporary workspace, office space for all the people helping you. You may also need to take over space from existing staff to create quiet areas like we did with John. We essentially kicked out instructional technology and took over all their space, took over conference rooms. It became kind of like one conference room became like a war room where we could keep track of what was going on.
Yeah, so I've mentioned this too. So they, at one point, sent me back to the iTech office, kicked all of them out, and I'm convinced to this day that that's why Todd Korn abandoned us. He still hasn't forgiven me for that. But they gave me that office room because one thing that doesn't work if you have someone that needs to focus on one system. In my case, it was just I had to get Active Directory up and running. Is constant interruptions, because there's just so much going on. It's just buzzing the whole time, and so they put me into this back office. But I think Shelby put a big sign up on it with a marker that said, "Do not enter unless approved by Alan Miedema and John Wiederspan," or something like that. But it's good to be aware of that. It's so critical in that it allowed me to focus without those constant interruptions, which of course is going to mean it's done more efficiently, quicker, and hopefully with fewer mistakes. At one point, we brought a developer in that I was working with in the AD rebuild. I'll talk about a little bit later. But so the two of us had that room. And actually, Sarah was just reminding me this morning, I forgot that they had nicknamed me Rapunzel, because I would very rarely come out of that room. But and if you do ever have a situation like that, just make sure to throw them a pizza once in a while, because humans do need to eat. And in my case, they took very good care of me.
Okay, I'll try to speed up here a little bit, so make sure we can get through everything. So we had 1,500 workstation users that were primarily support staff and career technical ed people that were actually really affected by this. We only had about 100 Windows workstations infected. That's great news, but you still have got to install new anti-malware, check them all before you bring them back online. And then because we built a new AD domain, we had to migrate all 1,500 workstations and their profiles to the new domain. That literally added up to thousands of hours of work. On a side note, the Macs are easy to join to the new domain, but because COVID-19 hit, we still have a lot of Macs that have not been joined to the new domain. So the users end up having two passwords, one for the domain services and one for their workstation. System Center. We actually had a good backup of System Center, but it doesn't work because SCCM keeps an internal ACL list based upon the SIDs from the old domain. So unless you have an old domain to restore it to, the backups are worthless. So we actually had to rebuild System Center from scratch. And of course, that means you have to rebuild all the imaging and software packaging from scratch. A big deal is what I call the surprise applications. So these are applications you have on your network and you don't really know exactly what they do or how critical they are. So for example, the big one for us was the food services point of sale system. Everything was stored on local workstations that got hit. We had no idea how much money any student in the system had or if they owed us money. We also had no clue that food services sold 10,000 meals a day, which amounted to $30,000 a day in business. In addition, the system is used to make reports to the federal government for funding back to the district for free and reduced lunch. This turned in to be our third most critical system just because of the amount of money involved. The library system keeps track of fines. We had no clue about that. We have a fuel depot system that keeps track of fuel that we sell to other local entities. We still had to sell the fuel and mark everything down on paper. Then there are the time of year surprises. So for example, we experienced a cold snap just after the attack. All the HVAC controllers had to be updated by plugging into each one by hand instead of using the central system too. Our intercom system, which ran the bells, was another surprise. At first we were told, nah, you don't have to worry about it. You know, the bell schedules don't change. Well, on November 3rd, there was daylight savings time change, and all of a sudden it became critical as people realized that everything would shift by an hour. Same thing with the door lock systems. So you got to be careful about these surprise applications that happen. Your end users are going to want to help as long as you're transparent with them and let them know what's going on. So if you tell them what it is and you keep them posted, then they won't be so critical of what's happening. So with the food services case, we let them know that we've basically lost a lot of stuff and it's going to be really hard to recover. In their case, they actually switched to offering just a few standardized lunches so they could actually record it on paper. They still ended up with a huge amount of data entry afterwards, but at least they could continue to work.
All right, so rebuilding AD has side effects. I don't want to take too much time on this and get too deep into the weeds, but I do want to talk a little bit about how the rebuild works. So on the first day of the attack, you know, I'm trying everything I can do to connect to AD and get any information I can out of it. Initially, I was able to connect with PowerShell, and I was able to pull all the objects. Actually, let me back up real quick. Because we had one domain controller built on server core, that's another thing I would strongly suggest. For whatever reason, and this may not be the case every time, but in our case, for whatever reason, that domain controller wasn't functional as a domain controller, but I was able to connect to it and pull object information off of it, at least initially. While I was trying to do this and trying to tweak some things, I ended up restarting the ADWS service. As soon as I did that, I lost all connection to my domain controller. Fortunately, you know, we keep trying. Again, as a system admin, you're always looking for these creative solutions. So I found out I was able to connect over LDAP, and that's where I brought Ski in, and he used his Ski magic to connect in with LDAP tools. He was able to dump all of the AD objects, the CNs, everything that we needed, at least, you know, most of what we needed, into an LDIF file. So then all of a sudden we had this very extremely valuable data to work with for our rebuild. That was huge, as you can imagine, if you work with Active Directory. So again, strongly suggest if you don't have a server core domain controller, spin one up. It's not difficult. It's actually really easy. We made a tough decision to rename the domain. Again, getting away from ad.nnc.org. The decision was not primarily made to get away from that name, but you know, it's like, do we rebuild it with the same name, and is that going to make things easier, or is it going to make things harder? Ultimately, we decided to go ahead and change that name, which meant, you know, you're starting over from scratch essentially for machines and rejoining and all of that. But I think in the long run, it would have been more problematic if we had gone with that same domain name. Hard to say, but that's my feelings on it. So because of what Ski was able to dump into an LDIF file, we now had the source anchor that I needed. Again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but For those of you that have worked with Azure AD and AD Connect, and that's how we sync on-prem up to Azure. I had my source anchor. This was super valuable because one of my stress points during this whole time was, I'm going to get AD rebuilt, but how do I actually make that connection back to Azure AD and not wipe everything out, not duplicate everything, not corrupt everything I have up there? Because again, remember, like I said, at this point, mail is working. Anything that authenticates to Azure AD is working. That's the last thing I want to screw up at this point. So it was certainly a stress point for me. So again, I had the source anchor, and so I thought, great, syncing back to Azure AD is going to be simple. Not so much. So through that process, let's see, connecting back to Azure AD and syncing. So I had originally used the object GUID. Again, I'm going to sort of brush over this because I don't want to bore everybody that doesn't deal with this stuff. But I originally used an object GUID as a source anchor. I don't remember why, but I did. Again, it was one of those things you make a decision 2 years ago. But that didn't match our immutable IDs up in Azure AD. You can't modify an object GUID. So, I mean, this is me and this developer in this back office just wrestling with these issues day in and day out. So ended up switching the source anchor on my AD Connect rebuild to use the consistency GUID, which it should have been anyways. We ran scripts to compare Azure AD immutable IDs to on-prem objects. And then eventually what we did is we took those old object GUIDs that we were able to get from our old domain, again, from that server core machine, and we actually took those and modified our consistency GUIDs in our new domain so that they match the immutable IDs up in Azure AD. There's a lot there, and I could talk for a lot more about it, but I'm sure I've already bored many of you by that. But just know that there is so much trial and error, and just wrestling with these things. And actually, after all that, I was looking at my notes a couple days ago, preparing for this, and I still duplicated all of my groups up in Azure AD. So even after all of this work, I was working even with Microsoft Premier support, which was pretty good, but they don't usually deal with these kinds of issues. So it was still us doing most of the work, but they were there for running syncs in staging mode, which is absolutely critical when you're doing this, to run it in staging mode, look at your reports, and just have a second pair of eyes looking at it, making sure, again, you aren't going to wipe things out up in Azure AD. And then I still duplicated all the groups, which caused me months of work. Let's see. We got 2 new DCs up in Azure. I wanted to mention that since our attack. We didn't have those prior. I have Azure backups going up there as well. I'm not 100% confident that those wouldn't be corrupted in an attack, but at least it's one more place that we have some backups that we could go to. And I built a test domain and a test tenant, which would have been nice to have had during this time. But again, using this opportunity to shore up on some of those things. Our test tenant is only A1, but it's better than nothing. And then finally changed how we used our privileged accounts, which leads me to our next slide.
Just one thing, when you sync to Azure, you got throttling issues.
You're right. For any of you that have dealt a lot with Azure AD, and doing a lot of work, a lot of data between on-prem and Azure AD, Microsoft, if you haven't notified the correct person or group in Microsoft to open up that for you, you will get throttled. We hit that during our mail migration, and then we hit that during this resync as well. So again, that was even with Premier support on the line, and even they had trouble getting that opened up. So it's good to be aware of that and start asking for that as early as possible. Okay, so here's where I get to eat some humble pie here. So, and I'm sorry, I haven't been able to keep up with the chats. There's a lot in there, and there's some great questions. Hopefully, we can answer here at the end. But somebody had asked, have you identified or have you talked about some of the footholds that maybe allowed these attackers to get in? Well, there were various things. There were a lot of things, but one of them was bad domain account practices, specifically with the domain admins group. And if you're listening to this, you may be on one of two sides of this, of saying, oh my God, I can't believe you guys were doing that, or yikes, we're kind of doing that too. If you are doing what we were doing, just just take my advice and just fix it right now. So bad domain admin practices. So basically, I was a domain admin, Ski was a domain admin. These are our user accounts. I tried to limit it as much as I could beyond that, but we'd have tech assistants come through and we'd have them there for a few weeks. Once we felt comfortable with where they're at, we'd sit down, we'd have a talk with them, because we needed them to do what we felt was domain admin level work for us. And so we'd have a talk. We're going to put you into this privileged group. We need to be very careful. I mean, it's all the whole spiel. And in my mind the whole time, and Ski as well, we knew it wasn't a good practice. We knew it wasn't the best way to do things. But again, getting back to security is not convenient. We just were stretched so thin, we didn't have the time and opportunities to really look at correct solutions and the right way to do that thing. At least that's my excuse. That said, it was on my mind. I was literally, the day that we got hit, I was 2 weeks. I had announced in one of our server team meetings, I was 2 weeks away from taking us all out of the domain admins group because I knew that it was a huge security risk. So 2 weeks. If I had done that prior, would it have kept this attack from happening? I don't know. I definitely know it would have made it more difficult. So it's just one of those areas where it's just, again, if you're listening to this and you're realizing we're kind of doing that too, and we have some areas in those privileged accounts or privileged groups that we need to clean up, do it sooner than later. Take it from me. So now we use super user accounts. So none of our user accounts, I mentioned this earlier, have any permissions, privilege permissions. So it's zero trust. So we use SU accounts, super user accounts now, and that's the account that we use to elevate. So even in a natural state, even they don't have elevated permissions on any Windows-based system. And what we do is, and again, this is not a perfect solution, but it's something I have in place right now, is I've written a PowerShell script, and it's, we call it start PAM for privileged access management. And we run this script, and there's only, I think, 3 of us that have access to be able to actually run this script. So we run it for ourselves to elevate our own permissions, or we run it for, it's a very limited group that we would even do this for, but there are a few individuals when they need to do some higher level of work, we'll run this for them. And it asks, what level of permission do you need? I've got some different levels in there. Who needs it? How long do they need it for? And why do they need it? And we are required to fill all of that out. It logs that, and it sets an expiration time. When that time is expired, it removes them from that group, so we don't have to remember to go back in and do that. And it also logs that to a Teams channel so that we're all aware on our team, hey, someone has just elevated their access. This is who got it. This is what it's for. And then we also have an additional script that runs starting about 6:30 at night and runs roughly every hour all through the evening and checks these privileged groups and basically checks for any unexpected members. So if there's anybody in any of these groups that's not expected, we start getting emails every hour. Hey, you need to check into this. You need to take this person out. So a couple of things. Again, these are not perfect solutions, and we're still on the journey of figuring a lot of this out and really finding good, solid solutions to some of these problems. But for right now, it seems to be way better than where we were at. Another thing we're doing is looking at hardware keys. I can't say much about that now just because we're just starting to begin testing those. And then another thing I wanted to mention is we implemented a third-party LAPS solution. It's most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with LAPS. Does the rotating password on your machines. We use it on our servers. We use a product called adm.pwd. I've been a little bit skeptical of it, so we're trying it out for a year. But the thing I like about it is you get the password rotation on your admin accounts. Plus, you get password history, which is really important. The problem with lapse we were finding is we would do a restore on a machine, and if it went past that date when the password had changed, often it wouldn't join to the domain, so you'd need the local admin password to get into it. Well, we wouldn't have the local admin password because it had been rotated out. So this one gives you password history, and it also encrypts passwords, which is obviously very important. So anyways, there's some of the stuff that we were doing wrong, that I was doing wrong, that we never should have been doing. But sometimes you have to learn those lessons the hard way. And this was definitely learning the hard way.
So one other thing we have with the SU accounts is they don't get email. We've actually turned on email because some of the online services, but we don't ever send email from them. So they aren't really visible outside to even get attacked by phishing or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're lucky. Our district was primarily a Macintosh district, but because many of our services run on non-Windows servers, including DNS, DHCP, OpenLDAP, most of our staff and students are on Mac, Chromebooks, and iPads. Most everything was still running. This was a primary factor in our ability to rebuild and not have to pay the ransom. While the loss of the Windows servers was a huge hit, it did not take down a number of services that were required for instructional staff in the school to continue working. And like John said, this is both a blessing in that most people are not affecting, and also a curse because some senior management wondered what was the big fuss. Email's working, instruction can go on. How bad can it possibly be, right? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the earthquake analogy, we were lucky in that most of our plumbing and all of our power was still working. DNS, DHCP, network servers were all up. Large portions of the city, though, all the Windows servers were gone. You definitely need to take care of your people. I don't know about you, but I've been a system admin, and when something goes wrong, I tend to just want to work until it gets fixed. Ransomware attack is a marathon. It's not a sprint. People will want to stay there, and at many previous jobs, I have stayed there over the night to get things done, but you just can't do that in a ransomware attack. Thank them for their efforts frequently. Celebrate the small successes, the cowbell idea. At times we were swamped with people who wanted to help, and it's definitely okay to tell them no. Our management did a great job of us taking care of us during the recovery. One of the assistant directors even made home-cooked meals during the longest days, so we didn't have to live off pizza and sub sandwiches. One of the biggest issues you're going to face is the uncertainty that your infrastructure is no longer safe. Anything strange will make you jump as you wonder if the attacker is back on the network. You will spend a lot of time tracking down false positives, and it's time well spent, but it is time. Several school districts were hit multiple times because they were not careful enough during their rebuilding process. And as the FBI informed us, attackers will try again. And like John said, we had an event last week where we had a problem with one of our ESXi hosts, and it caused a reboot on some services, and we're all wondering, oh my goodness, have we been hit again? Or is something on our network? It takes a lot of time before you finally get over that. So in wrap up, being understaffed is definitely the root cause of many of our issues. It led to security shortcuts, such as using normal accounts for domain access and leaving them in the domain admin groups all the time. We had no internal limitations between machines. We're basically the eggshell model with security based on a single set of firewalls that control external access. So once they got onto our internal machines, they had free access to everything. We had a failure to properly configure our antivirus to provide adequate protection. So it didn't even notify us that anything was going on. We had some system and log monitoring, but it was limited by license costs or either not trusted very well. We definitely had a lot of cruft in trying that really slowed down the recovery. Is this a system we actually have to recover? Where is the actual real data on the system? I got 6 versions of the documentation. Which one is accurate, right? And then we never did do any of the scenario game playing. Like we did it with our backup, saying, okay, if we have an earthquake, can we recover? If we have this happen, can we recover? We never did a scenario with, ooh, if we have a ransom attack, can we recover? That was never one of our scenarios. And having time to do that game plan is really important. What saved us is that we run on a heterogeneous structure. So most of the, 40% of the services, 95% of the workstations were okay. No problem. They could still do their work. Most of our data was recoverable either via snapshots or it was backed up to the NAS from vendors or from workstations that were not hit. We were able to recover all the SIDs and CNs from the old Active Directory system, which was critical in building up the new one. If John didn't have those group IDs that he could do to link the accounts up to the new one, I'm not sure what we would have done. And finally, the attackers were not more aggressive in that they didn't try to destroy snapshots, non-Windows machines, or exfiltrate data. Today, almost all the attacks, they not only do the ransomware, but they also do data exfiltration. So it's much more difficult today. And I cannot stress this enough. If you don't have good relationships with vendors and contractors and team members, you're going to have a really difficult time rebuilding after the attack. Silver linings, it gave us an opportunity for change. Everybody is much more aware, and when IT technology says, hey, we need to do this for security reasons, people perk up and say, oh, well, maybe we should actually do this. And that's enabled us to make some changes that were really difficult before. Employee training on phishing attacks, we can now do that, yay. And we can actually have a discussion about implementing multi-factor authentication for employees without being just kicked out of the room. We're able to upgrade a lot of our old servers. Our servers are now fully patched and we're working very hard to keep them that way. We actually have days now during the month where we go out and start cleaning up cruft. We're really much more aware of that and how much it takes to keep that maintained and stuff. We're basically getting rid of some of our technical debt. We've moved student information systems and other systems up to SaaS because they seem to be less liable to be hurt by an attack. We've managed to block access to our email from non-US countries. So there's a lot of things that were silver linings from the attack that helped us out. So it's question time now, as that is how we all learn.
Hey, real quick, I just want to take a look at the...
Yeah, okay, great. Ski and John, I think I speak for ACPE when I say thank you for the transparency and sharing these hard-won lessons. I think we've got a lot of questions here. Alan mentioned in chat that they're going to look at getting a separate Q&A focused session on the books for the large number of questions we've got in and some follow-up, but I think I'll read some now since we still have some time allotted in the session schedule. So let's get through those. First, we have some what happened questions, just asking for more details about the event itself. Susan asks, how and when did you determine the initial date time of the infected systems to know what data systems were okay?
That was done by the forensics.
Yep.
Oh, you mean when they were okay or when they were first hit?
We've actually got a question about the first, when they were first hit as well, so I think both would be interesting to people.
Okay, well, the forensics is what determined the first hit to the best of their ability. They go through all of your email. They find out when the infection was first put on a system. The forensic software they had us run was built by Cylance.
Yeah, and they, I think we mentioned this, but these guys, they'd been in our systems for months. We didn't know that at the time, but through forensics, we found that out, that Emotet had been allowed into our system, probably through phishing. And then eventually that worked its way up to TrickBot running on one of our domain controllers. And again, getting back to the necessity of a SIM solution, we had no idea it was running there, collecting credentials.
So now, like the SIM solution that we put in place, we haven't had another ransomware attack, but I have a reasonably good confidence because it actually runs a host intrusion detection on all our boxes, both Linux and Windows. And it's caught other things that have happened on some of our boxes. like cross-site scripting attacks on one of our boxes, it definitely will alert us to that.
Yep.
Great. Colton wants to know just how many IT staff did you actually have when you were hit?
Well, we've got 2 system admins. We have an email administrator, but basically 2 system admins for all of the rebuilding and stuff, plus a couple of TAs.
And then on our data analyst side, we had them working on the rebuild of the financial system. That's Jeff Miller and some of his team there. Yeah, I mean, Jesse, working on rebuilding the workstations and that massive project, obviously. So I don't know number-wise what our tech department was at. I mean, what, 20, 25, I guess, overall, when you really count managers and everybody else. Mm-hmm. But then also bringing in all of these contractors, people from Edmonds came over, which was awesome. And again, I was locked in an office, so we may have had more districts there. But there were a lot of people in there crammed in.
And that's why the relationship with the hosting vendor was so good, because we almost tripled our system admin capacity. We went from 2 to 7.
Yep.
Great. Okay, and then we've got a lot of what were you using, what was the name of the system questions. So I'm going to go through those a little rapid fire with you, if that's okay. First person, and some of these have been answered in chat, but I figured it's good to reiterate for everybody. What phone system do you currently have that managed to stay up?
Mitel.
Okay,
yep.
Great. How did you choose the vendor to help with the attack?
We didn't. The insurance company does.
Yep.
So we could choose. So we choose the contractor to help just because we already had a relationship with them and they'd been doing work for us on and off over the previous years, right? But in terms of the incident response vendor, we had absolutely no choice.
Understood. This one's been asked in a few different ways, and I think answered in a few different ways, but just to clarify for everybody, what endpoint protection, AV, and malware protection were you running at the time, and what did you replace it with?
I'll let you answer that one, John.
Yeah, at the time we were running Windows Defender, but I'll admit it was pretty unmanaged. And clearly, if that's how you're running it, your servers will fall over flat from an attack like this. It didn't stand up at all to it. If it was better managed, and I think there's been a lot of improvements to it, I'm not completely opposed to giving that another try at some point. Obviously, I have some skepticism and hesitancy there. So anyways, that's what we were running now. And again, we didn't even have a say in this, but our insurance company and the consulting firm we worked with told us we were going to run Carbon Black. Initially, we were running, I think before they had told us that, we put Malwarebytes up on our servers. And so for a while, we were running both. I wouldn't recommend that. The resource hit was pretty traumatic. But we got Malwarebytes taken off, and so we're just running Carbon Black, and that's still what we're running at this time, which we think it's doing a good job.
Yeah, we can't really tell. Now, Malwarebytes, we're actually pretty happy with on the workstation. That's the one that we purchased on the Sunday after the attack. When we first purchased it, we found some issues because we just grabbed something, but they have actually resolved practically every single issue we had with it. They have been an incredible company to work with. We've been very, very happy with them.
Great. What backup solution did you have that got owned? Asks Thane.
Veeam. I am not a fan of Veeam. I'm going to tell you right up front. And we did have it separated out from the domain a little bit, but they have an automated process, and they don't have to spend time encrypting it. They just hit the file system. And we normally would replicate up to AWS a couple times a year, and then we would disconnect AWS. Well, Murphy's Law, right? That was the weekend we were replicating to AWS. So they managed to corrupt the AWS store also, which we had put a RAFS file system on it. So we've replaced it with something called Cohesity, which has a lot more protection and is more like it's not built on top of Windows, for example. So these guys just won't even be able to go after it.
Some other questions. Brian asks, had you ever done a security audit or pen test of your environment beforehand?
No. And we've done the SIS-20 security audit now. We haven't yet done a pen test because why bother? We know we're going to be hit pretty hard. We need to complete most of the responses to the security audit first.
Understood. Jared asks, do you feel like you have a bit of PTSD because of the stress?
I'll answer that. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I do. Like I mentioned during the presentation, there have been things that happen, and even this last week, where it just instantly you jump to that and you get that feeling of anxiety and panic. And I mean, I'm sure most of you can imagine out there, this is nothing you ever want to live through. This is kind of like your worst nightmare, right? As an IT professional. And of course, never thought I would have to go through something like that. So yeah, it really does. I really do feel like I have some of that. Yeah,
I'm much more fortunate in that I don't really deal with the Windows side as much, so it didn't affect me nearly as much. The storage and the vCenter and the backups, I still have PTSD about the backup side, and we do a lot of checking, and I actually have another call into the vendor with Cohesity because I'm actually probably going to test exactly, do a fake ransomware attack and see if I can trash the Cohesity system, because I just cannot have that happen again. Finding out your backups are not good is just, I don't ever wish that upon anyone.
Great. Another follow-up question from Jared. Do either of you have any thoughts or advice on how K-12 hires and retains InfoSec talent? Do you see interest in any of the staff pickup around InfoSec skill sets?
That's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
We got really, really fortunate with our network security engineer in that he wanted to grow into a slightly different area and stuff, and we provided that for him. I'm hoping we can keep him, but InfoSec people get paid so much because they're in such demand by corporate America right now, and it's really hard for us to pay to keep them. So if you can find somebody who's starting out, I would say if you can find somebody who's starting out and really willing to learn and put in some effort, and you have the time to help provide them some guidance, yeah, you might get lucky and keep them for a long time. If for some reason they're a great fit and they like what your school district does and everything, you might only get to keep them for 4 or 5 years until they get paid twice as much to go to corporate America.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. We got a few questions about backup specifically, so I'm going to circle back to that.
Sure.
Jesse just wants to confirm, do you consider cloud service backups air-gapped?
Yes and no. So if the cloud service, you're backing them up to them, is disconnected 100% of the time, or if it's totally immutable. So with the Cohesity, they make it totally immutable. Technically, even if I get on the Cohesity as admin privileges, I cannot delete the things in the cloud, period. They are up there until they expire. And that's the part I need to test a little bit more. The other thing you can do is you can do snapshots. You can do versioning on an Amazon data store. And if you do versioning, then that's pretty much like a snapshot on a piece of hardware. Again, if the attacker can get access to your SAN and delete the snapshots, or if the attacker can get access to your Amazon data store and delete the versioning, sure. But that's really, really, really rare because these attackers operate like a business, and they know out of every 20 or 30 attacks, they'll get 5 ransom paid. They don't have time to go in and learn all the little details. It's more of an automated type thing.
Great, good answer. Devin asks, is there any benefit to creating paper copies of key documents like service settings, scripts, and implementation guides?
We don't actually do that. What we do is we had this beforehand, and this is actually something good that everybody should do, is we have all our documentation up in Google, and then we take that and we have a script that pulls that out. It pulls all our DNS information out, and it reads our vCenter and gets all the data about the various machines, sizes, operating systems, all that good stuff. And it dumps it into Git. And then Git is pushed out to our machines on a daily basis. So every morning when I come in, I actually have all my documentation, all my DNS tables, and everything about vCenter is actually on my local machine. And I think John does the same thing. What that means is that if something goes wrong, Google's down, or if our data center's down, I've got everything I need to rebuild it. I know what IPs to look at. It's all on my local machine. I think that's much better than paper copies.
Yeah, I mean, paper certainly isn't going to hurt. The one thing I think of when I think of paper copies is keeping them updated. I think it's hard enough to keep electronic copies up to date and remember to go back in and modify them for whatever new protocols you have in place. Paper copies are just going to tend to expire, I think, unless you're very vigilant about replacing them. In one case, though, I do have a paper copy in my cubicle at work, which I haven't seen for about a year now, but it has startup procedures on all of the Windows machines. Basically, we've had some data center issues in the past, bananas in the server room. And so it has been very helpful just to go and grab that down, say, okay, here's the startup process or shutdown process, whatever it is we're doing for that. So in some cases it can be helpful, but yeah, to Ski's point, having that copy, that local copy on your computer that's downloaded every night, and that electronic copy up there is getting those updates, hopefully from us, is very valuable.
Great. Roger asks, how many days worth of snapshots are you keeping on the backup storage?
Okay, so on our backups, the agreement we have with the district is we keep 30 days. So everything that is controlled by backups that we decide that we want to back up, we'll keep 30 days and then we roll it over. If people want backups for longer periods of time, we say, okay, just keep the file in that backup space. And then when you delete the file from the backup space, it'll be there for another 30 days. So for example, with the database folks, they have a space, and that's actually on the Cohesity, and they just drop their backups there. If they want to keep a backup around for longer than 30 days, they just don't delete it off of that space. It just stays there.
Great. Great. And then Jared asks, having gone through this, how often do you vet your backups, and how do you rank what to test?
Backups are tested weekly. And what happens right now, well, I'll speak to the operating system backups. I don't know how the database people test their backups, but the operating systems and the servers, we test weekly. The TAs basically go ahead and will randomly pick a machine and pull it back onto what we call our dead end network, which is totally disconnected from everything, fire it up, and hey, it came up. Great, we're good. We assume that if we get that far, that then we'll be all right.
Yep.
Great. Just a general question now. Are you fulfilling using MFA now? Was it hard to convince staff?
We are still in that process. So any of the privileged accounts I talked about earlier that we use for privilege elevation are using MFA. All of our user accounts on the server team, even though they're not privileged accounts, but they're using MFA. I believe all managers in technology are using MFA, and we've maybe another one or two other groups in technology has adopted it. It's something that is in discussion a lot. We want to see it pushed out. I think the next step will probably be implementing MFA for out-of-country access, at least. Right now, Ski mentioned we have it blocked. There's a special security group we can drop people into if they need access from outside, but right now it's blocked. So the next step, I think, would be removing that block and then just requiring MFA. Certainly our hope is to push it out to everyone and get adoption, well, maybe not adoption, but force MFA on everyone at some point. But as you can imagine, especially during this last year with everyone being remote and all the challenges of COVID, it turns out it wasn't a good time to push something like MFA on all of our teachers and staff. So certainly it's on the horizon. I think it's in our discussion, but we haven't gotten there yet. So if you guys have any good tips for any of the districts that have fully implemented it, I'm all ears.
Great. And then I think this will be the last question as we wrap up here. Since K-12 needs the help of vendors, do you monitor or co-work with your vendors differently after the incident?
Can you run that by me again?
Yeah, one more time.
Yeah, sorry. Since K-12 needs the help of vendors, do you monitor or co-work with your vendors differently after the incident?
Not really. Because the incident didn't come from a vendor as far as we know. And we had such good luck with the vendors that we had, right? I mean, literally, the hosting firm gave us 5 system admins. I think 2 of them were 3 were overseas and 2 were local, plus a project manager. I have no idea what they do with their other customers while they essentially were full time for us.
Yeah.
We were really fortunate. And then the developer contractor that we had, we've been working with that person for probably 10 years off and on little projects. And he just said, yeah, I'll just show up. And he showed up and worked essentially, really long hours.
Yeah, one thing I would add on that, I'm not sure if this is what the question was possibly getting at, but one way I work differently with vendors now is, again, getting back to security, is it's a primary focus now, where it was a focus before, but it wasn't a primary focus. And if a vendor, and I would argue back and forth with them, but if they were adamant about saying, this service account needs to be in domain admins or it needs to be a global admin, I won't take that anymore. It's just, there's no reason for it. So I guess you could say I'm a lot more aggressive with vendors and much more picky with how we implement those systems and the governance that is involved there. So that's how I've changed.
Great. Well, Ski and John, as in a big thank you from ACPE for sharing your experience and all these great lessons. I think that's all we have time for. So thanks again, and everyone else enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.